In an age of ever-increasing risk and connectivity, Control Risks has the insights, intelligence, and technology to help organizations seize new opportunities while remaining secure, compliant, and resilient. We'll also be here to help you recover from crises and manage complex issues.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's session of the Digital Energy Festival. I hope you've been enjoying the content so far. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce a panel from Control Risks. We're delighted to be working with Control Risks. The session title is Practical Solutions for Social Risk Management, Labour Rights and Human Rights and Security in the Energy Sector. So I'd like now to introduce you to their partner for Middle East and Africa, Tom Griffin. Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Damon, and hello to all of you. As referenced, I'm the partner who leads our Middle East and Africa region at Control Risks, and delighted to welcome you all to the Africa Energy Forum 2020 and today's session entitled, as Damon referenced, Practical Solutions for Social Risk Management, Labour Rights, Human Rights and Security in the Energy Sector. Now, very briefly, for those of you who don't know us at Control Risks, we are a global specialist risk consulting firm, over 36 offices worldwide, providing our clients with the insight and intelligence that companies need to resolve through critical issues and crises, realize opportunities and grow as a result. Africa for us has been at the front and center of our group's growth in the past. We now have over 400 people operating across the continent from 7 offices in Africa. I think it's that unique blend of geopolitical, regulatory, security, cyber, risk and compliance expertise that we bring that really enables us to support a huge number of energy projects across Africa, working with investors and operators across the project and deal lifecycle. Now, in today's session, I'm delighted to say that our Africa experts from Control Risks and also our guest speaker will provide some pithy insights and analysis on how to achieve some hopefully successful project outcomes when we look at this sort of quite gnarly topic of social risks in the Sustainable Development Agenda. As we're going through the session, which will be an interactive Q&A session, there is the opportunity to ask questions, so please do type those in to the panel at the right of the screen. And so with that, I'm delighted to welcome our esteemed panelists. First off, Sean McMurtry. Sean is currently based in Kenya. He was formerly with Tullow, who are an Africa-focused oil and gas company, and has over 20 years of experience on ground in Africa, providing practical support to companies on human rights and security-related issues. So welcome, Sean. Second off, we have Emmanuel Enujiga, who sits in our compliance team and is a consultant based in hopefully quite sunny and a little bit calmer Lagos at the moment. And Emmanuel has a huge depth of knowledge in supporting energy clients in the realm of sort of compliance, and particularly has a lot of experience in the issue of labour rights and human rights. And finally, last but not least, Catherine Fletcher. I'm delighted to say Catherine is joining us. She is the director who leads our Control Risks labour rights team for Africa and the Middle East. So with that, intros done, let's dive straight into the session. And maybe just a bit of scene setting from my point of view. I think it's fair to say that at Control Risks, we've seen a real surge in requests around environmental, social, and governance-related issues, particularly in the last 12 months. And it's really clear that these ESG issues, from the boardroom to the project site, are becoming increasingly prominent for both investors and developers on the ground. But I think key for this discussion is looking at what is practical to implement from an on-ground perspective in what are often very difficult and very challenging and complex situations. And also, what do we see as best practice in this realm from an implementation point of view? And we at Control Risk, we're increasingly being asked by clients as to how they could perhaps jointly manage the security and human rights and labor rights risks and issues, noting there is that complexity and they are deeply interwoven in terms of their nature. I think across the world we're seeing this shift, but increasingly in Africa, we're being asked to actively manage those labor and human rights risks and social risks more broadly for many of our clients, as if they are not handled appropriately, they can cause real reputational and operational impacts. So with that, we will lead straight into the Q&A session, and perhaps, Catherine, we can kick off with you. I think in your sort of broad experience, a lot of the work that you're engaged in sees you helping companies in the in the energy sector implement through frameworks and guidelines for companies. And perhaps, just briefly, what are some of the barriers that you see to labor rights compliance and some of the key issues that you are talking to clients in the energy sector around?
Yes, thank you, Tom. It's a great question. Honestly, I think for a lot of the companies that we talk to, they simply don't know where to start, because there's so much out there now in terms of, as you mentioned, sort of international best practice, legal frameworks, reporting frameworks, standards, guidelines. There's an awful lot out there to think about. If we take just the Equator Principles alone, there's 111 financial institutions that have adopted those, 10 of which are actually headquartered in Africa. But because there are no designated countries in Africa as far as the Equator Principles are concerned, it means that if you're a company or a project or a development that has received a financial product from one of those 111 financial institutions, it's not enough for you to comply with local law. You're also going to have to comply with the IFC performance standards on environmental and social sustainability. And that includes labour and working conditions for your direct employees, for contracted workers, and for your supply chain workers. And that's not just during the construction of your facility, it's also during the operation. So there's a lot even just there to start with. But then you look at things like the Global Reporting Initiative, which is becoming increasingly popular. More and more companies are choosing to report annually on their performance against sustainability standards like GRI. And in fact, relevant to the energy sector, the GRI is developing a sector standard at the moment, which is specifically for the oil and gas industry, which is expected to launch at the end of next year. Why is it that these reporting standards are becoming increasingly popular? It's because research indicates that companies that report against them actually benefit from improved reputation, improved profitability, and also cost reduction. So there's a big incentive there. But then also, let's not forget local legislation, compliance with that. What we often find is that at the corporate level, companies are well versed in what they need to comply with in terms of the local labour laws. But when it comes to the middle management or supervisor level, there may not be such good awareness of the local legislation, and some of the decisions that are being taken that impact workers might actually go against the local laws. So that's kind of one set of issues. And I'll briefly touch on the other, which I think is, it's fear of the unknown. I think some companies are really a little bit scared of what happens if they start to look into their company and into their supply chains and find problems that they can't fix, they don't know how to, or that they think are going to be very costly in terms of management time or just expenditure. Of course, added to that at the moment, you have COVID. And I'm sure there is a feeling in some companies at the moment, they just have enough to deal with right now, and maybe this is something to tackle another time. I would actually argue that no, now is really more than ever the time that companies need to be looking after their workers. Because if you look at the economic impact of the pandemic, there's no doubt that workers are probably more vulnerable now to issues such as non-payment of wages or redundancy. And then, of course, there is a lack of transparency in supply chains. The energy sector has very complex supply chains. In fact, I think I saw one study from 2018 that said that the renewable energy sector alone has 11 million jobs worldwide. That's a huge number of workers, and I'm sure a lot of them will be sort of, maintaining facilities and working at that end of the scale, rather than sort of engineers and scientists who design the facilities, for example. So there's a lot of potentially vulnerable workers out there.
No, that's great. I think as a sort of providing a bit of framing perspective, maybe Sean, turning to you now. So as I mentioned in your intro, huge amounts of experience ground in Africa. I was based in Nigeria for 8 years and attribute a lot of the grey hair and thinning hair to some of these sort of more troubling and quite complex social issues that our clients would have faced. But perhaps can you give a sense as to what are the key risks, key issues that you've seen on ground, and perhaps talk to some of the sort of internal and external challenges of how you co-manage some of those risks and how you see those playing out, or how you have seen those playing out on ground in Africa?
Thanks, Tom. Yes, I've got a bit of grey myself, to be honest, over the last 20 years. I think what you've got to understand is that the level of complexity around, an integrated response to social risk management, and by integrated, I mean, looking at a securitized or a security joint social response. I'll talk maybe a little bit about that later on as to why I think that's important or achievable. But I think ultimately the complexity of working on these issues, it is as inside the organization sometimes as it is outside. I think if you can think of an organization sometimes as almost a political system where people are vying for power, that potentially want to push forward a certain strategy or a certain approach, others with slightly differing ideas. And it's very hard sometimes internally to get everybody to a consensus position, especially when the ideas that are being presented are new or the initiatives are relatively new as well. I think some of the ways to do that, it's about, again, I said consensus building, being objective, being open to challenge, and challenging as well, I think is important, challenging the sort of status, challenging sort of thought positions on certain approaches or styles of working. And I think it's also very important to link your ideas to the business strategy and know the business. Ultimately, you need to understand where the business wants to be and who the business wants to be, and then try and, as I said, link your ideas to that. Externally, I think there's always a risk of industry observers looking at security actors and social actors potentially taking a lead together and considering maybe a securitization of the project. I can see that, I can understand that, but I think now the security industry and security practitioners are a lot more mature and a lot more sort of aware of the sustainability agenda now than they ever have been. And I think some of the frameworks out there sort of back that up and give teams the sort of tools and the experience that they need to deal with these complex issues. You talk about, there's been a recent report by the UN, one of the UN working groups on security, on business and human rights in complex environments, which talked about the need for companies to undertake, enhanced due diligence right across their supply chain, which backs into what Catherine's just been talking about. And I think ultimately some of the frameworks around voluntary principles, for instance, they promote a collaborative approach, multi-stakeholder frameworks. That's exactly what the VPIs are about, involving civil society. So I think ultimately, externally, it's important to draw in other actors to try and work collaboratively on these issues, very similar to that internal approach where you have to work together. You're talking about SDGs, we're talking about business and sustainability. The primary I see us operating in is SDG 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions. And equally, I think as importantly in 17, which is those partnerships that are necessary for those successful interventions. And that means the state, that means the industry themselves, and that also means civil society, I think, as a constructive and critical partner. I hope that.
Sean, and maybe Emmanuel, sort of turning to you, perhaps at a slightly more sort of practical level. I think a lot of companies now conscious of sort of looming regulation, a lot of sort of scrutiny on ESG more broadly, and a heightened awareness of some of these sort of social risks issues. One of the ways that we as a business and you guys out in the field do an awful lot of sort of management of this and trying to get ahead of these issues is around sort of audits and sort of compliance checks. How are you typically going about those kinds of audits from a day-to-day perspective?
All right, thanks, Tom. And it may be just instructive to say from the start that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to audits of this nature, and things like geography and jurisdictions and local legislation industry always have a role to play in determining what exactly is done and the approach adopted. But typically, we'd like to hold a broad range of consultations with key stakeholders in the labor supply process. These stakeholders include the businesses who are under review, entities interested in the labor practices of such entities, as well as the workers themselves. Depending on the peculiarity of the assignment, there may be other key stakeholders whose contributions are key to understanding the issues under review. Very early in the process, we also like to establish a sort of regulatory framework against which the labor practices of the business under review are checked. And this is usually made up of, international labor standards established by the ILO, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, and those sort of things, local legislation, policies and procedures, and it's often a combination and a mix and match of some sort of all these regulations. The range of issues that we review on labor rights issues are very broad and can be very complex, and also vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But typically we look at things relating to protecting the workforce, and here we try to test the substanding awareness and policies and procedures in place relating to child labor, issues of forced labor, human trafficking, and how these issues can pose a risk to the company's supply chain. We look at issues relating to worker conditions and employment terms, where we try to review things relating to employment contract transparency, fair wages, working hours, issues around overtime work and remuneration for these things, for overtime, issues relating to leave, pensions, medical, and other such benefits. On the front of workers' organization and labor grievance, we try to assess the company's practice as they relate to guarantee of legal rights, freedom of organization, freedom of association, and the existence of a grievance mechanism. We look at issues relating to discrimination and equal opportunity, where we try to assess the subject's practices as they relate to anti-discrimination, anti-harassment and equal opportunity. A very big issue as well is issues relating to health and safety, and here we try to understand by inspection and by understanding the policies and procedures and actions in place by a business relating to HSE practices, and where applicable the living conditions of workers are also assessed by visitations to where they live and how they live, and HSE standards in place. During this audit, we typically ask really critical questions. For instance, we try to establish that the company has a written and formalized policy, covering issues of worker welfare and labor rights. We try to establish and obtain evidence, or where possible, that these issues, or these policies rather, are sufficiently covered, or in terms of their provisions to meet international and local regulatory requirements. We try to establish that these policies have been communicated to the workers for whose benefits the policies in the first place have been set up. And we try to establish that the company implements these policies. And one of the ways we do this is by holding interviews with the workers, having a session where you're able to talk with them and glean their experiences, the experiences they've had so far working with the company and all of that. So essentially, we try to perform a sort of triangulation of information from all these sources. And in an ideal world and in an optimal situation, information from the policies and what they have in practice, as well as what the workers tell you obtains, should reflect off each other.
And Emmanuel, maybe continuing with you, and look, that's fascinating, I guess, to hear the sort of far-reaching and pretty expansive remit of some of these areas that you are looking at. Perhaps can we consider through what are some of the challenges that your teams on ground have encountered when conducting these sort of labour rights, human rights reviews? And seeing the terrible images on the news around Lagos, I can imagine some security challenges, but probably plenty of others to consider through. Can you quickly give us, or briefly give us an overview of those?
Yeah, talking about challenges, I think from our experience and working with businesses, conducting reviews of this nature, what we've often found as one of the biggest challenges is, the shared discrepancy between what they have written in policies and what actually obtains. You often have companies and contractors with really great policies that say all the right things, but it's almost completely different in terms of application. And some of the reasons why this happens as we observe and as we work with these companies is that we find that these policies are often set in motion and in place, and the standards are set by really senior, like super senior management of the company, sometimes global leadership of the company, and there is often a gap in terms of understanding and importance when it comes to the actual application by people who should be implementing these policies, typically local mid-management personnel. And it's often not always deliberate. Sometimes it's just, a gap in the understanding of what should be done and what the standards are, the applicable standards. Sometimes it's just an absence of knowledge or understanding by, the guys who are responsible for implementation, even the local labor legislations and those sort of things. Also, sometimes workers are not even trained or informed as to what their rights are and what the standards that should apply in relation to their work with these companies. And this is why it is even much more important to have these consultations and these discussions with these workers, because in our experience, they are the ones who are best able to tell you what actually happens. The challenge we often have, even in having these interviews and these consultations with workers, is that we often find that they are scared to talk. They're often worried about having those sort of discussions that make them say things that put their employers, in bad light, and they are often, refrain from having those sort of conversations. It often takes a lot of time and effort to build that rapport and that sort of trust that enables them have a sit down with you and have, an open, honest conversation with you and tell you the things that that really bother them. There is also the risk that before you even have these conversations and these consultations, the contractors or the employers themselves have had a chance to coach this stuff, but we have ways and we have adopted approaches that help us manage those risks and help us have more fruitful and more more open and honest conversations with the workers. During these audits, we require loads and loads of support and time from the employers and the subjects of this audit, cooperation which they are not always ready to provide. Sometimes it's difficult because we are seen as an enemy for lack of knowledge. Really, we're not typically seen as friends. We are typically seen as people who want to come and reveal gaps and issues that the company has in managing their labor supply process, and sometimes they treat information that should be readily given to auditors or people conducting these reviews as confidential. So sometimes they could tell you things relating to the payroll or the remunerations or the benefits of workers as confidential, and they're just not willing to provide that sort of information. And it often takes a lot of time and extended conversations and sometimes interventions of other stakeholders who are in a position to instruct these businesses to provide this information that you're eventually able to lay your hands on it. Closely linked to this, the fact that more often than not, these audits require us to examine a really broad range of complex issues within a limited time. And that is why we often advise our clients to not just be satisfied with a one-off visit or a one-off review, but ongoing monitoring is beneficial for you to have multiple avenues for review and just cross-checking for consistency of the issues and how they're being dealt with on a day-to-day basis.
Great. No, thanks, Emmanuel. And certainly just really interesting to hear the sort of the practical feedback that you see from experience on ground. Catherine, maybe turning back to you, we managed 8 minutes of this session sort of before we mentioned COVID. And I think this is sort of, as we know, it's challenged all of us to think around how we manage different aspects of the business. Keen just to hear maybe from you around how we feel that COVID has impacted social risks more broadly. Maybe firstly from you, Catherine, and then Sean, interested in your perspective on that as well. And any sort of examples that you've seen on ground would be really useful.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Certainly from my point of view, I was very concerned when COVID first, became such a huge issue that it was going to lead companies to really kind of drop any social risk management plans that they had in place, and as I say, focus on what was a crisis to start with at least. I was really relieved to see that that didn't happen, and actually I think all of the companies that we deal with, and I hope this is true elsewhere as well, they continued with their programs and looking after their workers and really checking up on what was happening with their workers, because they recognized that those vulnerabilities were there and they were emphasized, if anything. As I'm going to get this expression wrong, but it's something along the lines of that, necessity is the mother of invention. That has absolutely been the case with COVID, as we all know. The fact that we're able to have this conversation now between different countries is testament to the fact that we have found a way to adapt, and that's true of the social risk space as well. So we, for example, have conducted interviews with workers where we have used kind of video conferencing platforms, and we've done that with the support of the companies, with the support of their employers, and in a way that the workers themselves are comfortable, still delivered in their own language, for example, and still building that same rapport that Emmanuel mentioned, which is so important for the work that we're doing. We have conducted remote accommodation visits, for example, where we've had somebody sort of giving a video tour of the accommodation. Now, these things are probably not perfect, they're not ideal, but I would rather that we're doing something than nothing in these times. And I think it's important for the workers also to see that they're not being sort of forgotten and abandoned in favour of other, more pressing business issues, for example.
And Sean, from your perspective on ground in Nairobi?
I've been locked down for most of the time, if I'm honest. I get the feeling that the COVID situation that we're in it's almost arriving at relatively the same time where there is more discussion around the S and ESG, and I think we've had this conversation before. We have an environment. It's relatively straightforward. The governance aspect, again, very similar from a systems approach. But I think that social aspect has always been, as you said before, quite messy, quite a wicked problem, quite difficult. And I think that with emergent legislation around the labor rights, labor legislation, etc. And I was really encouraged to hear Emmanuel talking about what the workers tell you. I think that's fascinating. I think that's excellent. I think these sort of things are starting to I think come together. Investors are demanding more from companies, and I think purchasers and are also demanding more. And I think we're moving towards a situation where I think the social is starting to get maybe that the sort of teeth that they need to be considered alongside the EHS functions within organizations. That sort of importance, maybe the understanding and some of the framework stuff that you can actually use to really prove how you are performing from a social perspective and listening to your workers, etc. So I think there's a sort of a convergence going on at the minute.
And Sean, maybe sort of changing tack slightly. Again, thinking back to sort of my time in Nigeria, a lot of client support on energy projects in the Niger Delta. And you'd speak to clients there, and so they would state 80%, 90% of the problems that they would be facing, labor arrest, criminality, kidnap and ransom, were as a result of sort of mishandled social risks or social issues, should I say. And you've sort of referenced earlier that interwoven nature between the security and social issues. So I guess sort of thinking practically, how did you see that play out in your experience, and how do you somewhat integrate a social and a security management plan to really ensure that it goes from sort of theory and sort of guideline to actually be executed properly on ground?
We grappled with this, I think, for the 7 years up in Turkana with Tullow. I think we worked very closely. We had a very good relationship between the security and social. I would like to have seen it gone further, but we just didn't get the opportunity. I think the key element for me was data, high quality, ethical project data. And this comes back to what Emmanuel was just referencing there, just talking about, talking to the people. I think before I go into this, I think it's very important to lay out that, industry, we aren't intelligence agencies. This isn't about gathering intelligence. This is about gathering ethically sourced and managing ethically data from the ground, data from the people that you're engaging with, both as direct employees or as indirectly impacted community members or fence line members, however you want to refer to them. I think ultimately, industry's responsibility sits around, again, back to SDG 16 and promoting good development. And to have that and to underpin that integration between social and security, I think it's the high quality data. And you're talking about data from all the way across a business, from your human rights, sorry, Catherine, from your HR teams, also from your contracts and procurement guys, what sort of contracts are available, how those contracts are being managed, your key performance indicators for your contractors, how they're performing themselves. I think the grievance aspects, which Emmanuel talked about before, all of this data I think is really important, and it generally comes in with most organizations through their management systems, etc. But I'm not exactly, I'm not 100% convinced that it's all being put into the right place in the right way. And I think that's where that aspect of digitization, digitize your information flows. There's a lot of sort of really good tools and platforms out there at the minute, which allow you to go leaps and bounds beyond an Excel spreadsheet and really sort of put all your data in one place, integrate that, manage that, and then portray that in an effective fashion. I think one of the other aspects is once you've got that data in the right place, it's how do you communicate that with your teams? How do your teams communicate that? And I think this is importantly one of the aspects or one of the areas where that social and security can come together really well. What you normally find is your social teams are drawn from the local community. So they really have that understanding of the local context. Your social teams generally maybe from outside, former policemen, former soldiers. With both of them, what they have is they have the lexicon, they have the understanding, they have the ability to work with the state. The security providers generally have some sort of relationship with the state or some sort of previous relationship with the state actors, would be that the sort of governance or the security actors. And then you have your social teams, which are well integrated into the local community. So they can both work in sort of both sides of the fence in that effort to try and bring people together, that collaborative effort, which I talked about earlier. So what you can do, one of the things that we trialed up in Turkana was once you have the data, was how did you then communicate it effectively to the people around you, and then how do you bring all those people together into some sort of multi-stakeholder forum? We trialed a digital engagement platform across an SMS, using SMS across a GSM network. Now, we rolled it out. The first phase was some really good, ethically sourced, open, transparent data, asking people who they went to for problems with land, who do you go to for problems with water, who do you go to for marriage issues, how do you resolve conflicts, these sort of things. And what we found out of that research was, very what you would expect. The sort of the politicians, those more traditional leaders or formal leaders were very high up on the sort of the influence scale. But equally, there were less obvious influencers who came out. One of the examples was we had one of the religious leaders, and Emeron's second wife was very influential, which she wasn't sort of apparent to. We worked out, that this was somebody that we could talk to, or somebody that we could work with around certain problems and certain issues. Then the next step was that we put together the GSM communication platform. If you can imagine, it was like an enormous WhatsApp group. Everybody was able to talk to each other. Importantly, the communities were able to talk to each other, and sort of between villages, they were organising football matches and sending condolences for deaths, etc. So it created or it underpinned community cohesion. But we were also able then to use some software in the background that allowed us to identify tensions or language which talked about particular tensions in particular areas. So all of this contributed to the data that we had. It also allowed us to talk directly to the community across any sort of gatekeeping efforts or anything like that, so we could have that direct line straight into the community, which is again coming back to what Emmanuel talked about informing people about the rights, about listening to what the workers tell you. And we found that really successful. It was a great tool, and again, I would like to have taken it further, but we just didn't get the opportunity. Now, what we had planned to do with all of this data, the high quality data from within the project around your assurance act, key performance indicators, how your contractors are performing, and those sort of more tension, those qualitative and quantitative aspects of data, was to bring all that into a multi-stakeholder forum. The voluntary principles promote multi-stakeholder forums, as do a variety of other frameworks. What you quite find in these MSFs or multi-stakeholder platforms, forums, is that without really clear, high quality data, there's very little to hold on to. There's very little to actually sort of promote or to talk around. You end up talking about things which people particularly want to talk about, but may not be the actual issue to hand. So I think ultimately, coming back to the idea of data, is that with data, there's a little bit more truth. And with a little bit more truth, you can have a little bit more positive and progressive dialogue, I think. I don't know what you mean. That's sort of a bit of sort of practical aspect of what we achieved up until now. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, definitely, and just really interesting, as I think we see in a lot of our business, to see how technology and data really enables and supports and a lot of the issues that we've sort of typically addressed in the past. Perhaps, Catherine, to you, I mean, we talked a little bit, or you talked a little bit around the sort of different social risks at different stages in a project life cycle. So the challenges companies are facing will be very different at sort of construction phase through to sort of operational, and that time lag could be 5-10 years in some cases. I guess thinking around some of the supply chain issues, which is another aspect as well, outside of the sort of time factor, I don't know sort of whether you can talk more broadly around the sort of supply chain issues that we've seen, and perhaps again some best practices around how you can manage labor rights and human rights issues and the sort of risks as they sit within that supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that a lot of companies really struggle with. We often see that our clients, for example, have a really good grip of their own company. They really know what's going on, but then they start to look at their supply chain, and the further down that supply chain that they get, the kind of more opaque it becomes, and they really don't have a great idea about what's happening on the ground. Something I think is really important and works quite well is to try and shift from sort of the right to audit type clauses that you see companies kind of put into their contracts with their suppliers and just sort of leave it there as an option for them to pick up at some point. And also things like KPIs, which relate to performance against progress targets or about budgetary spend, and actually putting a labour rights angle or a sort of social risk angle on those contracts as well, so that it's then required of suppliers and subcontractors to report back into the business on their performance against labour rights standards, whatever it may be that's relevant, so whether that's local legislation or the IFC performance standards, for example. But it should become part of the normal flow of management information, that this is being reported back into sort of the top of the chain, if you like. And then that obviously helps to inform how audits are going to be carried out and when, and kind of helps build that risk picture. I think also it's, we've talked a lot, and Emmanuel obviously talked a lot about the sort of the depth that can be required during the audits and are really getting into the detail of what's happening on the ground. And I think sometimes that is off-putting to companies because it just seems like a complex or expensive thing to do. And I would encourage companies to look at their own businesses and see what existing resource they have available to them already within their business. So we often find that there are skill sets within the organization that can be put to good use in monitoring compliance with labour rights standards. You have staff in your human resources teams or in your payroll functions who can look at information that's been provided by the supply chain and really evaluating whether there are any kind of areas of concern. Similarly, we've touched on things like health and safety aspects. If you have team members who are already fulfilling sort of health and safety roles to do at the project site, can they also be used to look at things like employer-provided accommodation, where that health and safety background is actually really helpful, the qualifications are absolutely relevant, and you're not having to sort of find new resource, you're just adapting the resource that you already have, and that can really help to bring costs down.
Great, Catherine, thank you. And just a brief reminder, we've got a couple of questions coming through. Do record those. I think it's in the right-hand side of your screen. The team would be delighted to chat those. But Emmanuel, maybe back to you. So Catherine had mentioned that sort of depth that's required in terms of some of these audits. But what do you typically find when you engage in them? And so what are some of the sort of key findings that you would identify when going through some of these audits, perhaps particularly on ground in sort of West Africa and across the board?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. What we tend to find is that from our experience conducting reviews of this nature is that labor rights are largely unenforced in the region, and oftentimes it's the scrutiny from international and multinational businesses who have this understanding that increases awareness regarding labor rights and fair labor practices among businesses within the region. I think sometimes businesses are not necessarily doing enough to automate, or for lack of a better word, automate the compliance or accountability bit when it comes to that. Things relating to training and education of the personnel, so that across the board and across all across the employment organization, everybody is aware of what these rights are and can sufficiently engage the company when they feel like there are issues, or where they feel like those rights are not being respected in the way that they ought. Things relating to freedom of association and organization, where the company allows its personnel to unionize and to have interactions with other people who belong to the same sort of professional background for collective bargaining and those sort of things. We tend to find out that businesses are a bit shy about having their personnel associate with people who are able to engage the company on that level beyond just an individual, and press for a bit more. We find that labor arrangements are often characterized by like widespread informality, especially among semi-skilled and unskilled workers. And this class of people are often employed like on a casual day-to-day basis, many times no formal contracts. And this just means that the enforcement of some of these rights becomes a little more difficult, a bit more difficult, or considerably more difficult, with no agreement that sort of binds the employer to those fair labor standards. We also find that in engaging with the human rights, the human resources functions of the business with whom we engage, we find out that they're not necessarily aware of the sustainability risks posed by issues such as forced labor, human trafficking, and child labor. I mean, we find out that they have a fair understanding of what these things mean, but they are not necessarily, engaged with how those can become real to the business. And we therefore find that they don't necessarily have, a compliance plan, in terms of formal training and awareness, background checks, covering issues of this nature. We often find instances where employees, and I made mention of this before in some way, stifle the rights of their, the employers stifle the rights of their employees to associate and to unionize, be members of labor unions or trade unions, and they do this by either expressly telling them you are not allowed to do this in your contract, and you're made to sign to this, or they just don't communicate that they have the right to join those associations, and sometimes they feel like my joining this association or union may put me in a bit of trouble. Sometimes we find, poor and working hours to be irregular. Now, with high unemployment rates, that we all know in urban areas, this just means that there is this sort of oversupply of casual, where people will just come and there is readily, casual labor, and it just people agree to, unacceptable salaries or unacceptable remunerations, and they agree to irregular work hours, and this just allows contractors to drive lower wages and poor working conditions. And closely linked to this, employers and contractors don't necessarily provide employees the benefits that are stipulated, especially when stipulated by local regulating regions, where there is less, and for things relating to medical insurance and pensions and life insurance and things of this nature. We often find, and we've seen instances where workers are required to provide their own safety wear, and things like that. So while these, things exist, and while we have this obvious gaps as we look across businesses and as we work with our clients and companies and entities within their supply chains, we tend to see these issues. But it's certainly not all doom and gloom, because every once in a while we come across entities where we find that from our initial visits through the monitoring phase, we're able to establish that the company or the business has a robust, welfare, framework, and we find that businesses of this nature have far less turnover in terms of the number of people who leave, the business for lack of satisfaction of what is going on around them. And we all know that these things affect the bottom line. And with employee satisfaction comes, higher levels of productivity. So these are some of the sort of things we see as we've done this sort of work across the region.
Great. Thank you, Emmanuel. And Sean, we want to leave some time for questions, and we've got a couple of those coming through. But perhaps if you think back to your sort of time in Africa, time on ground, if you could do it all again, sort of what are some of the lessons that you've learned around how you practically manage conflict issues, conflict risks, social issues on ground? Just interested, you've mentioned some of the sort of data aspects, but yeah, what are some of those key lessons learned from you? Maybe just quickly.
I think number one for me is that there is no one solution, nor one provider, nor one person that has the answer to these things. These are these, wicked, messy development problems, which are very complicated and demand a sort of collaborative approach. So I think, point one, that's it. We cannot, as industry, manage these problems ourselves. It's just beyond us. I think the second one is when you're in these contexts, don't leave people out because they're problematic. Don't put groups or individuals into the too difficult box. Leave somebody outside of the room, then they invariably are antagonistic or become spoilers, and it just it's almost disrespectful as well. So I think ultimately, no matter how noisy they are, no matter how much tub thumping, bring them into the room, use the data, enter into dialogue. Don't close anybody down. And the third one is I think it's civil society. I'm a big believer in the role of civil society, particularly in this part of the world. I think they play a considerable role. I think they can have conversations that industry can't. I think they look at ways, they bring expertise that potentially industry doesn't have, specifically around peace building, conflict management, these sort of areas. And I think they play a vital role as a critical partner. And I suppose that would be my top three, Tom.
Great, thanks. And Sean, no, that's excellent. And maybe, Catherine, just before we turn to questions, maybe in terms of those sort of top three tips, as you might see them, to sort of what does good look like?
Yeah, I'm going to pick up, first of all, on something that Emmanuel had mentioned. Actually, Sean's mentioned it as well, which is around grievance mechanisms. And I think they shouldn't be underestimated in terms of the value that they bring. I think, you can have a great internal audit process, you can have external assurance audits happening as well, but if you don't have that really kind of easily accessible and efficient grievance mechanism that enables kind of proactive reporting of problems, then you're missing out on that information. We've certainly experienced that you can go and interview a group of workers, for example, and they won't share something with you because they are afraid about repercussions from their employer. But the same group of workers will make contact via sort of an SMS grievance mechanism or a phone line and report an issue in the knowledge that it's still going to be dealt with and it's going to go to the highest levels and be looked at. And I think these mechanisms are not often very expensive. They can just be there running in the background. And as long as they're fit for purpose, as long as they are easy to use, that they're communicated to workers, that they're available in the languages that they need to be, that they are obviously at no cost to the workers as well, then you have something which can just be there for years and will become hopefully a really trusted sort of way to interact with workers. So that's, for me, is an absolute sort of number one. Also, I would say get the procurement teams involved. So often we find that companies, for example, in the sustainability departments or other kind of areas of the business, they're really engaged and they really want to do the right thing when it comes to managing social risks. But unfortunately, there's a bit of a gap with the procurement teams who are still focusing on lowest price or sort of most technically capable, for example. Now, I'm not saying for a minute that those things should be stopped. They're obviously relevant, but it needs to be, social risks need to be brought into the procurement process. And as we've seen, if you end up engaging a company that is unable or unwilling to kind of meet the labour standards that are relevant for your particular project or whatever it may be, you will have a much harder time trying to turn that ship around. You've lost the leverage, of course, that you had in the procurement process. It's too late once you sign that contract. So I think, getting procurement involved and really kind of building it in is really fundamental. Finally, and I would say this because I work for a risk management company, but it is essential that companies sort of follow the risk. We do not have finite resources. We have to look at where the risks are coming from in our supply chains and the sector that we work in, and target where we can to have the most impact. So, for example, if you are somebody that is dealing in kind of feedstock crops for biofuels, and you know that child labour is going to be potentially an issue in the cultivation of those crops, then you know that that's where you should be focusing. It sounds like a really simple thing. It's actually quite complex because, as I said, supply chains are complex, but it's worth spending that bit of time to really understand where the risks are coming from and then focus on how you're going to address them.
And I guess as well, thinking about it as we might do it with any other risk in terms of sort of what's the likelihood and what's the impact of getting that wrong. Okay, no, that's great. Look, really appreciate all of your insights. Let's perhaps turn to a couple of questions from the audience, and perhaps start with one from Neil Mowbray. Neil, thank you. How can we create a universal, transparent monitoring system of labour rights and human rights in the sector? And the big question being sort of who would be best to lead on that. I don't know whether Sean or Catherine, you wanna have a stab at that one?
I suppose I can talk about the security and human rights aspect. I think a universal, transparent monitoring system, I think, is sort of potentially beyond. It's pretty hard to achieve, but I think there are elements such as the Voluntary Principles Initiative, which I think contribute very strongly to the way in which private sector or industry manages security and human rights risks. I think they are very progressive in the way they look at things, and they are really, really helpful in giving the tools that industry needs to manage the complex challenges they face. For instance, at the minute, I know the VPs are looking at sort of the conflict risk. Part of the voluntary principles require companies or recommend that companies undertake sort of conflict risk assessments. But I think a lot of the companies struggle with exactly what those look like. Now, we did a piece of work with Joe Turner and you guys with control risks in Turkana on this, and partnered with another organization and created a really solid piece of work around identifying not just the security risk to the project, but also the risks from the project to the existing conflict system. And I think, that's probably about as universal as you're going to get, is an organization that is willing to collaborate and to support companies, and into which companies must report regularly and openly and transparently their efforts to manage security and human rights risks. I think, I think that's a very good tool, and probably where we are for the minute. Whether they can progress past that, you come back to digitization and use of technology, etc.
Great, no, thanks, Sean. Catherine, anything to add to that, or we can move to the next question?
I mean, I was just going to comment. I think Sean's absolutely right. It's really challenging. I think we've seen great examples in other industries and other sectors of where companies can come together to set standards, principles. We've seen that in the construction sector. We've seen it in the electronics industry as well. We haven't really seen so much of that being applied to the monitoring aspect of those principles, for example, that have been established. Probably the garment sector is one that has it more so than others, but I think inevitably it comes down to individual companies and their own supply chains really getting to grips with their own issues and tackling those as they need to. So maybe it'll happen one day in the future, but I can't see it anytime soon.
And I think, perhaps that segues into an interesting point from Rachel Nelson, just around the sort of specific areas of the energy sector where we are seeing these sorts of issues. I don't know who might like to take that one. I mean, my sense is we're seeing it across the board, and there's probably not one single part of the industry where we're seeing this as an issue. I think we're seeing this as pretty far-reaching across the board, but I don't know whether you would disagree or agree otherwise.
Again, I'll jump in. I think, from the security and human rights perspective, I think I'm looking at Becky's question here, or sorry, Rachel's question presented by Becky. I think mining, yeah. I think, if you look at gold, if you look at diamonds, historically, artisanal miners, etc., very, very difficult to manage. Large sites, very portable product. And again, a lot of artisanal action around the outsides of established mine sites, which then lead to conflict between the mining companies, etc. I've seen some of the stats. I've never worked on mining, but I've seen some of the stats, and they're incredible in comparison to the sort of issues that you see around oil and gas or other energy projects. But I think importantly, there is, I think, a definite focus area at the minute with sustainable energy, the energy transition, the need for the minerals to support that. Vast majority of which coming out of sort of conflict affected states, fragile states. And I think the mining sector, as they grow in importance in the global transition, global energy transition, I think these areas will probably require considerable focus again.
Great, thanks. And we're bumping up against the time, so just one question in closing, and perhaps to you, Catherine, I'll paraphrase it. But what happens when companies get it wrong? And sort of what's the impact of getting this disastrously wrong? How have you seen that play out?
Yeah, I mean, the impacts can be very wide-ranging. At the sort of one level, at the worker level, in fact, you may find that workers, they're unhappy because they're not being paid. That can escalate into strike action, for example. That can become an operational delay on a project, and then it becomes, costly to the business. So, clearly, if you managed it in the first place, you would never have got to the point where your project is falling behind time, for example. So that's, one sort of small end, if you like. At the extreme end, you have companies who, if they're failing to comply with the IFC performance standards and they are relying on that financial investment, will see the investment being withdrawn. Now, that could be catastrophic, potentially, for the business, for the project. So, they can't be underestimated. And then, of course, the reputational damage that can be sort of tied up with all of this is significant, and maybe not even measurable, actually. So I think it's one of these that is probably ignored at your peril. I think especially now, it's not acceptable anymore to sort of say that, well, that's at the far end of my supply chain, it's not my problem. You'll increasingly see the companies who make those sorts of statements, in relation to a whistleblower allegation, will very quickly backtrack and say, actually, we do recognize that this is a problem and we are looking into it, because they realize that it's not acceptable anymore to sort of brush it aside.
Yeah, and I guess we've seen the sort of the issues and the pain being felt somewhat at the project site, really being sort of transferred up to the boardrooms as well, and some pretty spectacular examples of where we've seen that go wrong. So I'm fully conscious on time, and as I say, we are bumping up against the full hour. I just want to perhaps close the formal session by saying thank you to all of us for joining today. If you would like to speak to any of the experts around sort of their perspectives or any of the insights that they've shared, please do feel free to contact us directly through email, LinkedIn, or through the website. I think those addresses have been provided. Hopefully, the session has demonstrated there's plenty of sort of institutional knowledge and experience settling with the panelists and within control risks. And of course, we'd be delighted to discuss this through further with you or with your teams. And with that, I will close the session. Thank you very much, Duncan. We hope you've enjoyed the session. Many thanks to the AEF for hosting us once again, and we wish you all well for a wonderful rest of the day and the week. Thank you.
Africa Risk Reward Index provides a comparative snapshot of market opportunities and risks across the continent. Produced by Control Risks and our partners NKC African Economics and Oxford Economics Company, it maps Africa's opportunities and its challenges and offers a long-term outlook of key trends shaping the investment landscape in major African economies. Nobody can ignore the impact of COVID-19. Africa is struggling and recovery may be prolonged and uneven, but it could also be transformative. In this year's Risk Reward Index, we explore the post-pandemic landscape. Investors who stay with Africa despite the current downturn will not only have an important role to play in its recovery, but will also see some exciting changes and opportunities. One of the post-pandemic opportunities and second trend we explore this year is the rise of African tech, an already fast-growing sector that looks set to accelerate. For all that is new and exciting about African tech, perhaps its most important role in Africa's recovery will be to revitalize old industries. Finally, this year's Risk Reward Index looks at influence operations. Africa has always struggled to set its own narrative, but these challenges are becoming more acute as both internal and external actors actively push false narratives through influence operations and disinformation campaigns. The risks these pose to countries and companies should not be underestimated. Understanding the information landscape, what the narrative is, and who is seeking to influence it will become increasingly important.